One of the things we're going to do here in Introduction to Ozark Studies, and this is the Introduction to Ozark Studies, is each time we start a new segment, we'll have something that I call today's famous Ozarker and today's Ozarks vocabulary word. It's sort of a lighthearted little thing we do. One of the things that people often know about the Ozarks is the dialect, the language of the Ozarks, which can be, depending on where you go in the region, can sound sort of archaic. And we'll talk about some words that you might come across in the Ozarks, or that you would have come across in the Ozarks a generation or two ago from time to time. And we'll also talk about people, famous people, and using the term famous loosely. Sometimes they are actually famous people. Sometimes they just have a weird backstory, so they make my list. But we'll do one of those about every time we start a new segment in here. So this is today's famous Ozarker. And I always ask people if you can guess who today's famous Ozarker is, or maybe you know. There you go. She did, just last year. Helen Gurley Brown. Okay, that's good, Butch. We got our first right answer on the first class of the semester. I don't think anybody has got Helen Gurley Brown before. But if you've never heard of Helen Gurley Brown, you've certainly heard of things that she's been associated with, most notably Cosmopolitan magazine, which she edited for many, many years. And this is obviously a picture of her probably from the 60s. Sort of looks like it's sometime in the 1960s. And Helen Gurley Brown was born and partially raised in a little town called Green Forest, Arkansas, which is down in Carroll County, down south of Table Rock Lake, just across the state line, not too far down into northwest Arkansas. And she didn't finish growing up there, ended up in living various places, but certainly became very famous. And her mother, even after she became famous in the later years, her mother moved back to the Ozarks and lived for several years in northwest Arkansas, out in a rural area there. So she had a long time contacts with Arkansas. But you can see she died just last year. And that is our today's famous Ozarker. They won't always be as famous as Helen Gurley Brown, but hopefully they're usually just as interesting. And today's Ozarks vocabulary words is, or phrase, I guess you could say today. Does anybody know what short sweetening is? And in the Ozarks it would always be sweetening. This is it's a noun, and it's something you eat. No, that's long sweetening. You got that's a good guess though. Short sweetening is actually just what we call sugar, cane sugar. Yeah. In the old days, on Ozarks tables or lots of other tables around the country for that matter, you would have had your short sweetening, your sugar, and your long sweetening, which was sorghum in the Ozarks. Yeah, and that's what that was. So that's your first vocabulary word. And one of the things that you're fortunate that we always have an example how to use your Ozarks vocabulary word or phrase, and this one includes a fellow by the name of Delbert. We don't really know who Delbert is, but he's up there. Does anybody know what haint means? It can mean ain't. In this case, it's just ain't with an H on the front of it, which is how it was often pronounced by old-timers in the Ozarks, haint. Or a haint can be something else. Anybody know what else a haint can be? It can be a ghost. Yeah, yeah, a form of haunt. That was what a lot of old timers called ghosts, haint. You know, I hain't seen a haint in years. So that's what that could be. All right, so that's our famous Ozarker and our word or words for the day. We're going to talk about how you define a region, the different ways you can define a region. There are classes similar to this going on across the country, not about the Ozarks, but about other regions. And one of the first things that you have to do whenever you're talking about a region, regional studies, is figure out how you define that region. And there are a surprisingly large number of ways that you can define a region. And we'll talk about it. We won't settle on one in here, really. We'll just talk about the different ways that you can define a region. We'll also talk about where the term Ozark comes from. We'll get to that in a minute. And talk about where the Ozarks come from, why they're here, what made this geographic region we call the Ozarks. Now, a lot of what we'll talk about today comes from geologists and geographers. And geographers refer to this area in the middle of the country as the interior highlands. These are hills, mountains that are in between the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains, the interior highlands of the country. As you can see there, the map showing the interior highlands actually has a larger area than our Ozark map. And that's because the interior islands also include the Ouachita Mountains. And the Ouachita Mountains are down in western Arkansas, actually that direction, western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma. And the Ouachita Mountains are technically, geologically mountains, whereas the vast majority of this area that we call the Ozarks is not technically a mountainous region. But we'll explain what I mean by that just in a minute. Now, as I mentioned, when you talk about defining a region, drawing boundaries around a region, there are lots of different ways to do that, and different people have different methods of doing that. A geologist doesn't define a region the same way a historian does, and we'll see how that works. Scientists don't often define regions the same way social scientists or humanists do. So there are lots of different ways. Now here's the map that we had. Yours has got the county names on it. This is the unnamed map. This is a geographer's definition of a boundary around the Ozarks. This is a map that comes from a book called The Ozarks Land and Life by Milt Rafferty, who for many years was a geography professor here at Missouri State. And you can see that this is clearly demarcated. He uses basically scientific data to draw his boundary around the Ozarks. So that what he's basically saying is everything inside this boundary line is similar enough to everything else inside the boundary line and different enough to everything outside it that this makes up an identifiable region. It's a scientific definition using soil types and rocks and all that kind of stuff, things that historians usually don't bother very much with. But it's a very helpful boundary. As we will see, this is not a boundary that can always apply to the Ozarks. One of the things we'll talk about is that there are lots of places that fall within that geographer's definition of the Ozarks that historians don't consider part of the Ozarks. There are lots of places in the geographer's definition of the Ozarks where if you go there today and ask people, are you in the Ozarks? They would say no. And you show them the map and you say, wait a minute, you're in there. But that's where it comes down to how you define a region, why you're defining a region. But this is a map that we'll use a lot just because it's a nice map. And it's mostly accurate from a cultural standpoint, but not completely accurate. But this is one definition of the Ozarks. And you can see this definition of the Ozarks, this boundary goes way up, even lops over the Missouri River. This is the Missouri River up here, and it even gets north of the Missouri River in some places. Goes practically to the Mississippi River over here. That's the Mississippi. And even out into even a little corner of Kansas there. So that's one definition of the Ozarks. That Ozarks is going to be about 45,000 square miles, give or take a few hundred miles. That's roughly the size of the state of Ohio. So we're talking about a pretty big region here. But as we'll see, some maps make it even bigger for various reasons. Here's another map showing the Ozarks. What's different about this map besides the fact that it has color on it and words? Right. This one lops over the Mississippi and even includes parts of southwestern Illinois. That's a map that most geographers don't use anymore. Most of the time we don't include Illinois in the Ozarks nowadays. It used to be more common to include parts of southern Illinois in the Ozarks. And I know people from southern Illinois who claim to be from the Ozarks. And if they want to do that, that's fine with them. You know, a lot of it is about self-definition, how you define it yourself. But most geographers don't include Illinois in the Ozarks anymore. Though if you've ever been over into southern Illinois, a lot of it is indistinguishable from southeastern Missouri. There are lots of hills, pretty country over there. People go to look at the leaves and change in the fall and stuff like that. So there are a lot of similarities. Other than that map is mostly the same, maybe just a little bigger around the edges. Sometimes the government defines regions and money gets involved and politics gets involved, and by the time it's all over, you know, there's no regional integrity at all in these things. Back in the 60s, the federal government created the Ozarks Regional Commission, the ORC. Some of you may have heard of the Appalachian Regional Commission, much more famous. It's still in existence today and includes hundreds of thousands of square miles back in the mountains in the east. But just a couple years later, the federal government created the Ozarks Regional Commission. When they first created it, this was it, this darkened area in the middle. So you had much of southern Missouri. You had basically that interior highlands area that we saw on an earlier map. You're talking about the Ouachita's, the Ozarks, and then some border counties around them. And the Ozarks Regional Commission was created for the purpose of funneling money into the region. The Ozarks has long been a depressed area, and it was one of those areas identified by the nation as a place that needed money, needed investment, improved infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. And so once they started funneling money into these small projects, what happens? Politicians get involved, and the politicians from neighboring counties and neighboring districts say, hey, that'd be nice to be able to dip our hand into that ORC pot every once in a while and get some money out of there. So after a while, the definition of the Ozarks expands. If you can see down here, it gets a little bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the 1970s, it includes all 5 of these states. Louisiana becomes part of the Ozarks in the 1970s. That obviously nobody in their right mind claims Louisiana is part of the Ozarks, but it's an instance of how you define regions. And as far as the federal government was concerned, those regions eventually became a 4-state area and then a 5-state area. Every piece of land in those states came under the definition of the Ozarks Regional Commission. So again, sometimes you can define things in ways that don't make a lot of sense, and that certainly doesn't. Now here's a map that I like a lot. We're eventually going to quit looking at maps, although I could spend half the semester looking at maps. Some of you are probably big map fans too, especially colored maps. Those are really nice, like this one. This is nice. The reason I like this map, and this one obviously is just Missouri, and it's from the Missouri Department of Conservation, is that this map comes pretty close, this yeller part, or yeller, since we're in an Ozarks class, this yellow part is pretty close to what I would call a good, solid definition or boundary of the cultural Ozarks. It's smaller. It doesn't go up to the Missouri River. It doesn't go near as close to the Mississippi River. It includes less area. But I would say most of the people who live in this yellow area would consider themselves as part of the Ozarks, and it would be a closer definition of the cultural Ozarks, because those border areas up here along the Missouri and over here along the Mississippi River are the places where generally, even though geographers say, okay, this is in the Ozarks, you go to those places and most people would say, no, we're not. We're not in the Ozarks. And we will eventually talk about the historic reasons why that's the case, why people who live in those areas don't necessarily claim to be Ozarkers, don't claim the Ozarks, and will say the Ozarks is somewhere else, because it will eventually make sense. But that's a pretty good map there that separates the Ozarks from the Ozark border. Okay, so we've looked at a few maps and looked at some different definitions of how to draw boundaries around the Ozarks, how to decide where the Ozarks is. And we've got some more maps coming, so always maps waiting for us. We talked a little bit earlier about the fact that the Ouachita Mountains are actually mountains geologically, physically, whereas most of the Ozarks is not a mountainous region. We hear the term all the time, Ozark Mountains this, Ozark Mountains that. And especially if you go down around Branson, you know, a lot of that Ozark Mountain music and all that kind of stuff is thrown around. But Branson is most definitely not in the mountains, and the vast majority of the Ozarks is not in the mountains. So what do we call the Ozarks? Are they hills? Is it a plateau? Highlands? Actually, you can call it just about any of those. I'm not going to fight you, whatever you call it. You know, that's sort of up to you, but any of those are probably okay. The Ozark Upland. Sometimes it differs by what class you're in. I've noticed over the years reading books written by different kinds of scholars, and a lot of times a geologist might use the term Ozark Uplift, where a geographer might say the Ozark Plateau. When we get to the term Ozarks, that's more of a cultural, historical sort of thing, because there you're saying, okay, this is a definable region and a definable people. Ozarkers live in the Ozarks. And so that's a little bit different there. But we'll eventually decide on what's probably the best term to use for the Ozarks after looking at some more maps here. Here's yet another map, a geologic map of Missouri. The one part of the Ozarks that geographers, geologists would truly consider mountainous is this red part right here. Does anybody know what those are?
Is that over by Elephant Rocks?
Yeah. Yeah, the Elephant Rocks State Park is right here in the red part. And what do we call those mountains over there? Has anybody ever heard of the St. Francis Mountains? Yeah, the St. Francis Mountains are the one part of the Ozarks that are geologically mountainous. You've got volcanic rock over there. Geologists tell us that the oldest of the The foundation for the St. Francis Mountains dates back probably something like 1.65 billion years. These are ancient mountains that were eroded down to practically nothing over time. And one of the things you've had in that since 1.65 billion years ago is you've had over and over these periods of flooding that wear down the mountains. Then you have these periods of uplift where the earth is uplifted because of tectonic activity. And then periods where you have flooding that wears them back down, uplift. It sort of goes back and forth for hundreds of millions of years. The most recent period of uplift that affects pretty much the whole Ozark Plateau happened somewhere between about 25 and 5 million years ago, where you have this kind of gradual uplift and you have erosion that creates our hills and what look like mountains. So except for this one little place, these ancient rocks, what's left of these ancient mountains, and there's not much left of them. If you go over there thinking you're going to see the majestic mountains of the Ozarks, the St. Francis Mountains, you're probably going to be sorely disappointed, especially if you've seen the Rockies or even if you've seen the Appalachian Mountains, because the St. Francis Mountains aren't very high. You know, if you've been over there, what's the highest point? Tom Sauk Mountain is what, 1,700 something feet above sea level?
I lived there for 8 months and I never noticed really big mountains.
Yeah. There's a big tower up there. You can climb to the top of the tower, and you're on top of Missouri pretty much. That's the highest point in the state. But they're not, nobody sees those and thinks, grand mountains of America there. There's no snow caps or anything like that on them, but that's what's left. I mean, they're millions and millions of years older than the Appalachians, certainly older than the Rockies. The Rockies are baby mountains in geologic time. And so that's what eventually happens to mountains because of erosion and weathering and all that sort of stuff. But that the rest of the region was uplifted for the last time between 25 and 5 million years ago. And what we get today is the results of the weathering of that uplift. And what we have really are valleys. Yeah. We have, it's just the Ozarks, most of the Ozarks is the result of erosion that gives the appearance of hills and sometimes mountainous areas, but it's really just created by erosion. And I've got a little thing here. There's a good book called Missouri Landscapes, A Tour Through Time, that's all about the natural history of Missouri, and I just wanted to read one little quote here by the author's name is John Hawker, and he writes, with the exception of some of the granite knobs, St. Francis Mountains, with the exception of some of the granitic knobs and deep valleys in the St. Francis Mountains, all other hills and valleys of the Ozarks, indeed all gravel bars, carbonate rock bluffs, glades, caverns, and flowing springs were created during the intense period of erosion that accompanied this third major period of uplift in the tertiary age. We may speak of the Ozark Mountains or the Ozark Hills, but truthfully, the Ozarks are valleys and not really hills or mountains. The Ozark region was a flat Cretaceous coastal plain until cut by tertiary erosion. We owe most of our Ozark scenery to this uplift and the valley cutting that followed. And so according to Hawker and other geologists, if you had been around about 25 million years ago, you would have seen a place that looked something like the Florida Everglades in the Ozarks before that last period of uplift to create the plateau that then erodes over those years. The Ozarks would have been a much swampier place. So it's hard to envision, but you're talking about millions and millions of years. And 5 million years ago is just a little speck in terms of the Earth's age. So that's what we get, our little red area in there with some other kind of older areas around it. And most of the Ozarks at different times in history was underneath an ocean. Maybe with the exception of some of the higher points there in the St. Francis Mountains, the entire Ozarks at different times has been under the oceans. That's why we have limestone rocks with fossils in them and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to short Arkansas. I'm from Arkansas, so Arkansas doesn't have as nice a colorful map, as Missouri does for that. It'd be nice to be able to fit them together, same color pattern, all that kind of stuff. We can't do that. But this is a geologic map of Arkansas that continues the Ozark story down into North Arkansas. Another way of thinking about the Ozarks in terms of geography and geology is that this is the dome of the Ozarks, the St. Francis Mountains area, is sort of the dome of the Ozarks, and everything sort of goes out from there. Now, what we will see is that down here, in this part of the Ozarks, the elevation is much higher than it is up here, though the Boston Mountains, as they're named on this map, are not technically mountains. They have some of the characteristics of mountains, and in some places the Boston Mountains are more than 2,500 feet above sea level, but the Boston Mountains were created, again, by geologists say that when North America and South America collided around 300 million or so years ago, that when the Ouachita Mountains were created, were folded, tectonic movements just sort of tilted what we know as the Boston Mountains, just kind of tilted them up. And so they're higher in elevation than the rest of the Ozarks, even though they're technically not mountains. They weren't created by volcanic activity. They weren't created by folding like the Ouachita Mountains were. So you just kind of had plates under here and just sort of lifting them up a little bit from down here when the continents collide. And so you've got your dome, and then out in here everything just kind of flows from there. And then you got kind of an uplift down on this side of the Ozarks. And you can see here in the darker areas, the higher the elevation is in the darker areas. And down in here you got the highest elevations where it's kind of white, gray looking. The highest point in the Ozarks is in Newton County, Arkansas. It's over 2,500 feet above sea level. Near an old community called Red Star. And it doesn't have a name. The hill doesn't have a name. It's the highest point in the Ozarks, but no one ever bothered to name it. So it's still waiting, I guess, on a name. Now we can subdivide the Ozarks. This is just a clearer map of what we saw. There are really two different ways that we subdivide the Ozarks. So we got the Ozarks region that we've identified, or at least using geologists and geographers' definitions of the Ozarks and boundaries of the Ozarks. But we can subdivide that. The easiest way to do that is subdivide it into these four big regions, or four regions of different sizes. Obviously, we've talked about the St. Francis Mountains. The bulk of the Ozarks falls within this huge area that geographers refer to as the Salem Plateau, or sometimes the Central Plateau. And you can see that some of you who are from the Ozarks are from the Central Plateau. If you're not from Springfield or Willard or Ash Grove and you're from the Ozarks in here, most of you are from the Central Plateau. It's a huge area. And then, of course, you've got your Boston Mountains. And then we're here in Springfield, we're on the Springfield Plateau, which is a relatively flat part of the Ozarks and fertile part of the Ozarks. Historically, the Springfield Plateau has been the most prosperous part of the Ozarks. You can see that it extends down into southwest Arkansas, where you've got the prosperity, or into northwest Arkansas, where you've got the prosperity of the Waltons and the Tysons and those Fortune 500 companies down there. Here in Springfield, the Queen City of the Ozarks. Anybody get that one right? Okay. The Queen City of the Ozarks, the largest city in the Ozarks, prosperous compared to the rest of the Ozarks, great prosperity and has had for a long time. But these are the four main subregions. Now what you can do, and geographers do this, is then subdivide the regions even farther. You still get, this one makes a smaller central plateau. They call it Central Plateau on this map instead of Salem Plateau. But here's Salem. I don't know which Salem it's. There's a Salem, Missouri, which is right here, and right down here is Salem, Arkansas. So if you're in Salem and you're in the Ozarks, you're in the Salem Plateau. You can count on that. I don't know which one it's named after, but it's one of those. But there's a smaller Central or Salem Plateau. You still get your Springfield Plain and your Boston Mountains and your St. Francis Mountains. But then you name some other little subregions that are either border regions like the Missouri River border or the Mississippi River border. Those are obvious. You know, anybody can find those if you know where the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers are. And then you got these other hill regions, the Osage Gasconade Hills. Where do they get their name from? The Gasconade River and the Osage River. The White River Hills, obviously, named for White River, which starts, White River actually starts down in here in the Boston Mountains, but flows up through here and comes down this way. How would you pronounce that? Okay. There are lots of different ways. That's really good. Cordaway, Cottaway, I've heard it. I've heard it pronounced Curtis. I've never heard it pronounced Courtois. As we'll talk about later on, there was a lot of French influence in the early settlement of the Ozarks. Not so much the early settlement as the early naming of physical features in the Ozarks. The French had a lot to do with that, especially in the eastern part of the Ozarks. This is a remnant of that, but at some point, the English settlers, as they usually did, English-speaking settlers, as they usually did, got the pronunciations all out of whack. And so Cordaway or Cottaway is usually how this is pronounced, even though we don't know really how you get there from that. So that's a way to subdivide the region into 9 places if you want to really get specific. And sometimes, you know, we can really get specific. So really what you've done is just take what was a huge Salem or Central Plateau and cut these little hill regions out of it and then cut the border regions. Now, we've talked about the fact that the geographers and the geologists use definitions that rely on dirt and rocks and science to draw boundaries around their region. When you're a historian, when you're looking at the region culturally, historically, it's a little harder to do that, as we will see. And as I mentioned earlier, there are people inside those boundaries that geographers draw, that geographers would say, you're in the Ozarks, and the people would say, not so much. Wait just a minute, we're not really in the Ozarks. And there are people who fall outside of those boundaries, who would claim to be part of the Ozarks. I had a student in this class last semester who was from western Missouri, and his hometown was just outside of that boundary line of the Ozarks, but he very much associated himself with the Ozarks and considered himself an Ozarker. So you got people who are inside the lines and think they're out, people who are outside and think they're in. So how do we define the human Ozarks, the cultural and historical Ozarks? Some of the questions you might ask: do you have to live in the hills to be a real Ozarker? Can you be a real Ozarker in Springfield? Is it too big? Is it too flat? I had a friend who came to a conference here in Springfield from Texas once, and he flew in to Tulsa and drove to Springfield, and he got to Springfield, and the first question he asked me is, where's the Ozarks? He was expecting this hilly, place that looked kind of like a smaller version of Appalachia, and he didn't see it yet. In Springfield, it's flat. It's pretty flat here because we're up on high ground. We're on the spine of the Ozarks. I-44 in some ways kind of follows this high point from the outskirts of St. Louis down into southwest Missouri. It's high ground. It's an old trail. The Indians used it. The pioneer settlers of the Ozarks used it. We use it. I-44, first railroad was built down that crest. And so we're up on high ground, and it's not, the higher the ground is in the Ozarks, usually the flatter it is, with the exception of, the Boston Mountains and the St. Francis Mountains. But because this is where the water starts, it rains, then it runs off, and the closer you get to the bigger rivers, the hillier, the deeper the hollers are, the deeper the valleys are, that kind of stuff. Do you have to live in a rural area to be a real Ozarker? When somebody says Ozarker or somebody says, think of somebody from the Ozarks, what comes to mind? What image comes to mind if you're thinking of somebody from the Ozarks?
The hillbillies on the Bugs Bunny cartoons.
Okay, you've seen that one. Yeah, the hillbillies on the Bugs Bunny cartoons. We may watch that later in the semester. It's one of my favorites. The Beverly Hillbillies, they were associated with the Ozarks. The creator of the Beverly Hillbillies, Paul Henning, had vacationed in the Ozarks in southwest Missouri as a boy. He was from Independence, Missouri. So that's what often comes to mind. Usually, if you think of somebody from the Ozarks, you don't think of your accountant from Springfield, You don't think of the college professor from Fayetteville, Arkansas, where the University of Arkansas is. That doesn't come. There is that association of the Ozarks with rural life, poverty. Whether or not it's accurate doesn't really matter. There's that association. And a lot of you just didn't want to admit that, when somebody says, think of the Ozarks, you're thinking of some hillbilly character with a floppy hat and a coon dog and, a big rifle of some sort or a shotgun, double barrel, something like that. But that's sometimes what we think of. Do you have to be white? You have to be Protestant? When we think of hillbilly caricatures, we generally don't think of black people, right? Now, historically, there have always been blacks in the Ozarks. There were thousands of slaves in the Ozarks before the Civil War. Their descendants remained, many of them in the Ozarks after, and there have always been black people in the Ozarks. Probably most of us didn't think of them when you think of sort of the typical Ozarker. And a lot of them were rural, lived the same sorts of life as other people in the Ozarks. It's harder to define the cultural Ozarks. There are people, there was one study that was done about 40 years ago in Taney County, and that's where Branson is. And the woman was an anthropologist, and she came to Taney County and lived, went native like anthropologists do, and studied the region. And what she did was tried to come up with sort of an ethnic identity for a real Ozarker. How could you tell if you were a bona fide Ozarker? What characteristics would you have to have? And one of them, she said, is that at least in Taney County, you had to be Protestant. If you were Catholic or you were non-Protestant of some sort, it meant that almost certainly your ancestry didn't go very far back in the county, that you had moved in or your parents had moved in from somewhere else and hadn't been established long enough to be a bona fide Ozarker. Now, that would differ from place to place. You get along those fringe areas of the Missouri River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley, and there were lots of German Catholics who settled in those areas. Interestingly enough, a lot of those same German Catholic communities would tell you, we're not in the Ozarks, even though the geographers might. So maybe there's something to that. Maybe the fact that 95% of the 19th century pioneer settlers of the Ozarks were Protestant sort of placed that stamp on the region, that sort of Protestant evangelical Bible Belt kind of stamp. I don't know. And a lot of these others had to do with stereotypes, banjo playing, moonshine drinking, that kind of stuff, the things that we often associate with the Ozarks. But when it comes right down to it, the Ozarks is a social construct. It's something that we've created. The Ozarks didn't exist before we said, hey, this is the Ozarks. Just like the United States didn't exist before we said, here it is. Or North America. We have defined the Ozarks, especially when it comes to human terms, we've defined the Ozarks ourselves. And a lot of that has to do with its history, the people who settled here, the people who pushed out the natives who were here. And that's how we've sort of taken their characteristics and used that to define the Ozarks, create this social construct, this place that we identify as the Ozarks, when 200 years ago it really didn't exist. The Ozarks, like we know it, no one was going around saying, I'm going to the Ozarks back in those days, with the same meaning that we have today. So it really was a social construct, and is. So all of these things play into that, to how we define ourselves, and self-identifying with a region. Some of you are from old families who've been in the Ozarks for generations. Some of you probably grew up here, but your parents came from somewhere else, or maybe your grandparents came from somewhere else. And you may consider yourself an Ozarker, but your neighbors back home may not consider you an Ozarker. They may consider you a newcomer. Even if you don't know any other place as home, they may still consider, because your family, they remember when your family showed up from Chicago or wherever that was, and they may not think of you as a newcomer. So there's really no easy way to define the cultural Ozarks and who's an Ozarker, who's not. What do we, how do we decide who's a bona fide Ozarker? I'll use this little story and then we'll wrap this part up. One of the things I do a lot is when I'm out traveling around the region, trying to get a better feel for this cultural definition of the Ozarks, where the boundaries are, is a lot of times I'll just stop in places, especially if I'm sort of on the fringe of the region. I'll just stop somewhere and I'll ask someone, am I in the Ozarks? Or are you an Ozarker? Or something real annoying like that. And so one night I was coming back from, I think I was driving from Jeff City to Rolla. And I went through this little town called Vienna, which is up in Marys County. And if you can barely see the dots up here. Vienna corresponds with this dot, the dot on the east, or the right dot. Vienna is in Marys County. It's an old, as you would expect, an old German-speaking settlement. Predates the Civil War. And so I stop in Vienna and go into the convenience store there. I think there may be two, or maybe just the one. I don't know. It's not very big at all. And I walk in and I go up to the counter and buy a soda pop or something like that. That may be one of our words later on, soda pop. And I get my soda pop and I go up and I say, I ask the woman working at the counter, am I in the Ozarks? And she looked at me kind of funny, like, they usually do when I ask that question. And she said, no. And I said, well, where would I have to go to get to the Ozarks? And she said, Iberia. She was real specific with it. And she said Iberia. So she said, it's about 12 or 15 miles down this way. You get there on this highway and you go down there. So here's Vienna and here's Iberia. Two great town names, by the way. In neighboring counties, Iberia's in Miller County, Vienna's in Marys County. And so here's where we were, not in the Ozarks. She said, go over here in the Ozarks. And that kind of tells you how tricky cultural definitions of a region are. Vienna, an old German town, a German-speaking town from years ago, Catholic. didn't really associate itself with the Ozarks, which to them was, those other people, those English-speaking people or those Protestant people. That's somewhere else. The Ozarks is that we're not hillbillies. We're not part of the Ozarks. Iberia was part of the Ozarks as far as she was concerned. Had a different history to it, and you could have that story repeated all over, especially all up and down through here. One town, not Ozarks, 10 miles away, Ozarks. So that's part of the difficulty in identifying the region. And that's why you can't just use the geographer's definition if you're talking about people, if you're talking about history. It doesn't always work that way. And as I mentioned earlier, you got people over in here, like my student from last semester, who say, hey, yeah, I'm from the Ozarks. Even though he lives on the prairie, what geographers would consider, the beginnings of the plains over there. And you got people down in here. You can go down south of this line and find business names, Ozark this and Ozark that, and people who would consider themselves in the Ozarks, even though, again, they fall outside of the boundaries of the geographer's Ozarks. And one of the things that we did a couple of years ago, a student of mine and I did, we decided, okay, if you define the region by where people say they're in the region, then let's do that. And we contacted the Secretary of State's office, and they sent us this list of all the business and nonprofit organization names by county in the state of Missouri. And we went through there and we got all the ones out that had the word Ozark in it, or Ozarks. And we tabulated those by county, and the darker the green on here, the more common the use of Ozark was, or Ozarks. And so you can kind of see the heart. This becomes was for Missouri only, obviously. I would say pretty much all of the Arkansas counties solidly, not much debate down there. But in Missouri, you've got your heart of the Ozarks, and the closer you get to the fringes of the region, the less frequent people use the term Ozark and self-identified as part of the Ozarks. And the last thing is, where does the name come from? Does anybody know where the name Ozark comes from? Kind of a weird name.
Well, I know it's like has to do with French and has to do with a tree or something.
You got the French part right, and the Indian part right. Yeah, it's not an old world name. It didn't come across the Atlantic with anybody. What happens is it actually comes from this place. We know that the French were the first Europeans to settle the Mississippi River Valley, and one of their earliest outposts was a place that they eventually called Arkansas Post. It's not in the Ozarks. It's way down the delta of eastern Arkansas, close to the Mississippi River. In that flat area there, it looks kind of like a pancake. It's been burnt a little bit. And they used a name for a local Indian tribe there. Other Indians called this tribe the Arkansas. And they started signing their letters and their official papers that they would send back to Canada, where the French had come down into the Mississippi River Valley from, or back to France. They would sign these Oz Arkansas, the French term meaning from or of, in the Arkansas, in the land of the Arkansas, from the land of the Arkansas, AUX, Arkansas. After a while, they abbreviated this, and this is what historians tell us where the name comes from. They abbreviated this to Ozarks, AUX, ARCS. It was usually spelled in those days, Ozarks. And eventually that Ozarks catches on among French traders and people, and they start referring to most of the area west of the Mississippi as the Ozarks. The traders carry the term up the Arkansas River into northern Arkansas, into Missouri. And this region becomes, for the French, Ozarks, the land of the Ozarks. And eventually, in the early 19th century, an Army officer, a U.S. Army officer, travels out putting together maps not long after the Louisiana Purchase, mapping the area that has become this huge nation. And he uses the term Ozark Mountains and kind of plasters it across almost from Texas all the way to St. Louis. You know, this high ground, kind of the interior highlands that we talked about. He calls this the Ozark Mountains. Eventually, we know that the Ozarks come to apply only to that area north of the Arkansas River, that part of the region. But that's where it starts, Ozarks. And obviously the English speakers thought the French spelling just made no sense at all. So we'll spell it however we want to, and it ends up O-Z-A-R-K or O-Z-A-R-K-S. And that's, so you got your French, you've got your Indians, you've got your English coming in and changing the spelling, and so it has an interesting origin. The name does that may be the most unique thing about the Ozarks, how it got its name, and we'll talk about that uniqueness as we go on this semester.